Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Back in 2010, I spoke at the Beyond Prevent, Achieving Security and Challenging Extremism conference in the House of Commons. I was critical of many of the surveillance aspects of the previous government's Prevent strategy, such as Project Champion, which placed security cameras in majority Muslim parts of Birmingham. However, in the last 3 years, initiatives like these have been scrapped, as the government has made strong efforts to listen to practitioner feedback. The entire Prevent strategy has undergone significant reform. As of last summer, it is now a statutory duty for schools, prisons, local authorities and NHS trusts to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. The strategy also includes non-violent extremism, which has been defined as opposition to fundamental British values, including democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty and mutual respect and tolerance of different faiths and beliefs. While these are universal values, rather than specifically British ones, I think it is critical to actively uphold them and use them to present a strong counter-narrative to extremist voices. Women Against Fundamentalism, or WAF, defines fundamentalism as modern political movements that use religion to gain or consolidate power, whether working within or in opposition to the state. Craftily, they can also amass power from civil society mobilizations. The ultimate aim is to present their interpretation of religion as normative, quash any kind of dissent, and gaslight said dissenters as being crazy and unreliable, or casting them outside the fold of Islam. All fundamentalist movements, no matter which religion they take inspiration from, have sought to control women's bodies, minds, and voices. As my associate Kulsum Bashir from the Muslim women's group Inspire said in a recent Guardian interview, when you have ideologies out there that homosexuals are going to be condemned to hellfire, that you mustn't talk to gay people, or that if this was a Muslim state they wouldn't be allowed, I do have a problem with that. I'm proud that the interpretation of Islam I adhere to is inclusive. It does not promote hatred or violence, or sow the seeds of division or suspicion. There are other interpretations that sit across the spectrum, and I don't want my children to go down those paths. Bashir is responsible for delivering Prevent training to police officers and teachers in Avon and Somerset, with the aim of making sure that children are kept safely in their families and are getting the best out of their educational experiences. Rather than asking professionals to spy on their charges or single out particular incidents, the aim of the strategy is to get them to look out for a whole range of concerning behaviours. It is part of the pastoral care that all good teachers take seriously, and makes sense because pupils spend more of their waking hours with teachers than with their parents. Children who are deemed to be vulnerable to radicalisation are sometimes referred to the government's anti-radicalisation programme, Channel, which has seen more than 4,000 referrals since 2012. But contrary to popular belief, a referral to Channel does not equate to being grassed up by police, as one young person put it. Channel panels are chaired by the local authority, and the police are only one of several agencies represented. It might surprise people to know that only 56% of those referred for channel interventions are Muslim. Further, there are many examples of Prevent successfully turning young women away from a path of extremism and fundamentalism. A young woman in Bristol who started wearing a headscarf in sixth form then disengaged from lessons and distanced herself from friends. Her teachers spoke to her friends, who conveyed that she had described them as not good Muslims anymore. The young woman said she just wanted to focus on Islam and thought that voting made one complicit in a so-called kuffar system. Once she was referred to Channel, a female theologian spoke to her about faith and identity in a nuanced way. The young woman had never had this kind of exposure and came back to finishing her A-levels. Another story related to the 15-year-old Yusra Hussain, who went missing from Bristol and ended up in Syria. Other girls in the vicinity ended up sympathizing with her after being dumped by Muslim men who they had slept with. This ties in nicely with Mia Bloom's research on redemption and the fact that some people see membership of an extremist group as providing a means of redemption for committing so-called sins. In response to this, Kalsoum Bashir led a workshop on relationships between men and women in a faith context. In this, she said it was natural to be attracted to people, but the young women shouldn't feel pressured into doing anything they don't want to do. Far from shutting down debates on controversial issues, this is an example where Prevent created a space for hot-button issues to be discussed in a safe and secure environment. The facilitator was careful to foster both critical thinking and caring thinking, as in how we relate to others around us. This fits in with Ofsted good practice guidelines too. At university level, the Prevent strategy requires the broadening of debate to include counter-narratives and alternative views at Islamic society events. A third example is the Muslim boy at Parkfield Community School in Birmingham, who not only demanded a prayer room, but insisted that female Muslim pupils needed to cover their faces with a headscarf. A roundtable discussion took place with the pupils' parents, who were very supportive and understood the teachers' concerns. Finally, there are a number of high-profile myths surrounding Prevent. The Guardian posted a critical article on the policy on 12th of January, where it praised Frederick Bremer School in Walthamstow for putting up a display of photographs on the Paris attacks with comments from Muslim students. What the article failed to include was that this, and the discussion on Paris in citizenship classes, took place because of Prevent, not in spite of it. The most important thing is to enable young Muslim women to reconcile their identities as female, British and Muslim. I'm confident that the Prevent programme has advanced enough to make way for these exchanges. Of course, this doesn't absolve civil society practitioners of our responsibilities in this area. While we should not hesitate to correct state institutions when they make mistakes, we should not automatically see them as the enemy when they are partners in safeguarding. Thank you.
So, as someone from a Muslim background, I'm kind of very familiar with what the Muslim narrative about Prevent is, and it's gotten to a stage, I feel, where saying you're supportive of Prevent is almost like saying you're supportive of Israel. It's just become this huge, you're just, the norm, the standard is just for people to be very, very critical of it, see it as it's seen as a very racist policy. Islamic societies and the NUS all across, like the NUS is also passing a lot of anti-Prevent motions. So what is Prevent doing to try to engage more with the Islamic community and to try to present the good side of Prevent and why we need anti-radicalization policies?
At BMSD, we actually organised a symposium on the 23rd of May to bring together government representatives, other state officials from organisations like the Metropolitan Police, civil society practitioners and academics, some of whom had been very critical of Prevent in the past. And we got all of these three groups together, very disparate groups, people who would have very heated conversations on the subject on social media. We got them together in a room and got them to listen to each other. And it was a very, very effective event, and we're actually going to put together a report from those conversations and present it to government in order to not only help them improve the Prevent policy, but to improve the PR of the Prevent policy, because as we've seen, the Prevent lobby is very, very strong. And sadly, a lot of the time, they peddle myths about Prevent as opposed to actual facts. Not only that, but they never seem to suggest any alternatives to Prevent either. So it's this lack of constructive action that I think is a real problem.
Right, we have a gentleman there. Thank you,
Hi Tehmina, thanks very much for being with us today. It's a real privilege to, I've heard about your work, so it's good to see you in person. This question is kind of follow-up from the lady's question just now. I myself am a history student. I recently graduated, so I'm sort of very familiar with what's been going on in universities, etc., especially with the NUS. And just, as I say, following on from that previous question, could you shed some light onto why the sort of various groups like the NUS and stuff are peddling the myths that you've sort of elucidated? Sort of what interests have they got, and sort of what sort of manipulative techniques or whatever you want to call them are being engaged in order to kind of present this front against the Prevent strategy?
For example, there was a high-profile story, the eco-terrorist case, so-called eco-terrorist case, and that involved a school in London where a boy had talked about eco-terrorism, and he was taken to a side by two teachers. They had a 10-minute conversation with him, and he immediately returned to class. But if you were to listen to the Prevent lobby on this case, they make it out to be far worse than it was. And the boy's mother actually took the school to court in a judicial review. And this has been all over the papers. But what you don't see is the other side, which is what happened in that judicial review, where the judge was actually scathing of the mother's case, and in fact ordered her to pay £1,000 of the other side's costs. So that is a classic example of a case where the Prevent lobby has not made the full facts of the case available.
It's been my experience at university. I've often bumped into, say, overseas students from places like Pakistan. They've come to the UK and they've wanted to, say, engage in their Islamic society or engage in their diaspora society, but they found it complete. They've been very surprised by, of course, the tendency of diaspora clubs and societies to presenting an almost kind of manufactured McDonald's-like representation of their perception of their culture or their religion or whatever, and they've often been turned off by that, actually. I don't know if you found that yourself. Yeah, I mean, from your understanding, do you know whether the kind of the generality of student Islamic societies at UK universities kind of tend towards one way or the other for any particular reason?
I find that, again, I mean, they're very much dominated by conservative speakers, and even the group FOSIS, which is the Federation of Student Islamic Societies, it very much has that bias. You would never find a secular or liberal speaker, Muslim speaker, invited to their events, for example. I've noticed that when I've been invited to give talks at universities, the societies that invite me are never the Islamic societies. It's always the AHS, the Atheist, Humanist and Secularist Student Societies. And even when the AHS societies have tried to get the Islamic societies involved, either they're not interested, or in some cases they'll actually actively try and obstruct the event. So again, it's really worrying. Yeah.
Thank you.
Do we have any further questions? Yes. Yeah. Yes, please.
Just because you were asking about kind of the motivations, and I don't feel like there is this conspiracy per se against Prevent. It's just the general narrative. Because I was telling Tehmina before, I was the chair of my Islamic society, and we would have these. Basically, there was one time when the vice chancellor kind of invited. There was a Prevent officer coming, and then they invited the Islamic society, and the default position for me to take was obviously to be like, well, Prevent is obviously racist and it's targeting Muslim students and it's going to make Muslims feel alienated, and that's just the and then other students would feel like they have to support that, because otherwise you're just helping demonize Muslims, and it's just something you see everywhere. You see it within seculars and liberals and wider society, where it's like if any Muslim says, oh, this is discrimination against us, the tendency would be like, yes, obviously you're right. So it's a much wider problem. It's not that I don't think anyone actively sits there and thinks, oh, how are we going to stop, prevent these evil people. It's just, I mean, they do, but it's not for bad intentions. It's just the
Comment rather.
Yeah. Were there any more questions? Yes, Peter.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question. I've got so many things going through my mind. Your focus is fairly narrow on the whole, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. Now, I'd probably be classed as an extremist because I have huge problems with what's called British values, but I'm very in favour of democracy. But I think that it's not something you've either got or you haven't got, but it's a relationship between all the various sections of people in the society, and that democracy can be enhanced using certain methods, and it can also be undermined. And I think in recent years there's been a lot of undermining, not least of all the last Labour government, new Labour government, opening out schools to religious organisations. Now, I try not to focus on Muslims. I know this is a part this is what's happening in this room, but I mean, I see all religions as basically they're male supremacist organisations, and they vary in their intensity, obviously. But there's a lot of Christian organisations which are extremely undemocratic, some Jewish organisations which are very undemocratic, and the schools are being opened up to these people. So I'd just like to sort of spread that a little bit wider and say I know that we're talking about Islam here, and that's fair enough. But there's also just one final point. There seems to be an awful lot of confusion when you hear reports of prison officers having problems with Muslims, and they don't know how to deal with it because they feel they're being accused of racism. But of course, Muslim is not a race. You know, it's a belief, which is a totally different thing. I mean, I think there's only one race anyway, the human race. But I mean, apart from that, anyway, there.
Thank you.
So I don't know if there's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, we were speaking before about Islamophobia and how you prefer to refer to it as anti-Muslim sentiment.
That's right.
Well, many Muslims I know have they're against British values and democracy, and there's a sentiment on the other side. And how can an organisation as yourself kind of balance the fact that there is so much anti-British or democratic sentiment to the democracy as it stands from a lot of the Muslim community?
Well, actually, the British values agenda, there were a number of organisations working on it before it became a thing sponsored by the government or promoted by the government. There's something called the Islam and Citizenship Education Project, which was set up by the Schools Development Support Agency in 2010. And BMSD were actually on the board of this. And the aim was to highlight commonalities between Islam and British values, or universal values, as we prefer to call them, and have these as part of a syllabus for students in Muslim majority schools as well as madrasas. So the lesson plans would cover topics like Islam and volunteering, Islam and being a good citizen, Islam and women's rights, women's engagement in society. And this was a very, very successful program. So successful, in fact, that we had interest from the United States, various other countries who wanted to adopt this program for their own schools.
Great. We have another question here. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll shout. I'm used to me shouting. All right, I'll talk. Yeah, the way you describe your work, it sounds that you do some similar work to the Quilliam Foundation. Is there any overlap there, or do you work in with Quilliam as well? And secondly, it's to do with a couple of years ago. I was at a talk at East London Humanists, and in the audience was an off-duty policewoman. I'm sorry if some of you have heard this story before, but you're going to hear it again. And in her patch in East London, there was a problem with prostitutes, and they were being visited by Muslim men. And she said under normal circumstances they would just go in and clear up the area. But because it was Muslim men, they were having meetings and they were pussyfooting around about how to deal with it, because they didn't want to upset the local community. And I find that well, more than a bit strange. If you're breaking the law, you're breaking the law. And as it comes, you know, when we talk about persecution, in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, there was a big problem with football hooliganism. And I don't remember the fans of West Ham or Chelsea or Man United complaining that they were being persecuted when undercover police went into the grounds to try and identify the people that were causing the problem. So I don't know why the thing that you mentioned in Birmingham was so bad, and why you thought that it should end. So.
Well, actually, I can probably answer those two questions in one, because although we are somewhat similar to Quilliam in terms of our aims and objectives, and some of the work we've done, we're also very different. And one of those differences actually came out during Project Champion, while that was in operation, because Quilliam were supportive of it at the time, and we were not, because we firmly believe in civil liberties, and we're probably sort of further to the left than Quilliam, just slightly, although of course they do wonderful work, and we've collaborated with them on a number of occasions, most recently at the AHS convention, where Osama Hassan from Quilliam and myself spoke on a panel on Islamic reform.
Was that you?
Yeah.
Yes, I
yeah. Yeah.
That was very good.
Thank you.
What about the other, about identifying like this example? And I'm sure that's one example of many. This problem in East London. I mean, I'm sure it's going on elsewhere.
We've actually written something similar on child sexual exploitation, particularly the grooming cases in the north of England. And at the time, we wrote an open letter signed by a number of different feminist organisations and others, both Muslim and non-Muslim, to say that there should be no pussyfooting and political correctness. We need to call this out for what it is. And if there is a certain preponderance of people of a certain ethnicity in terms of the perpetrators of child sexual exploitation, that's something that needs to be highlighted rather than swept under the carpet.
We have one more. Yeah. Oh, Phil, you.
Following on from what Rumit said, because I think what he said was really important, this question of how can you reconcile Islam with universal values, because fundamentally the Sharia law and everything that's contained within the Quran and the Hadiths is in many ways discriminatory. How are you going to do that without either a reformation of Islam, or, well, you can't, because it's a complete conflict with the values that Western democracy holds to be inviolable. principally, they're not things that can be reconciled, are they?
Oh, I would disagree with that, but then again, we do promote reformist scholars, such as Abdullahi An-Naim of Emory University, who's written a book on Islam and the secular state and the future of Sharia, as well as Sheikh Khalid Abu al-Fadl, who's written about Islam and tolerance, as well as Islam and democracy, whole books on these subjects. So there are reformist and liberal scholars out there, but my particular issue is that when you go to any mainstream Islamic bookshop, you're not going to see reformist scholars or progressive scholars. You're going to see very conservative Salafi and Deobandi texts, and it's the popularity of those, the fact that those have been mainstreamed and normalized. That's what I have an issue with, when there's no sort of real counterbalance to those. Because progressive Muslim movements, they've only been popular in the last few years. For example, 3 years ago, we set up something called the Inclusive Mosque Initiative, which is a pop-up prayer space where men and women can pray behind women imams, for example, and they have openly LGBT people on the committee, and host events on taboo-busting topics like Islam and humanism or Islam and mental health. And they promote reformist scholars or liberal scholars like Dr. Amina Wadood, who was one of the first women to lead a mixed prayer with men and women standing side by side.
Sorry, does that mean that you think that the edicts of the Quran are wrong?
I think that the edicts of the Quran, if they say, for example, that a woman can, or any Islamic edicts, whether they're from the Quran or not, the conservative interpretations where they say men, for example, that women cannot lead men and women in prayer, I think they are wrong. Yes.
At the front, thank you.
There was quite a lot on Radio 4 this morning about FGM. They're worried because this is the beginning of the holiday season and people are suspected of taking their children abroad to have this terrible thing done. How is it that families can be privileged to live in a country like this and not learn how absolutely shocking it is?
Well, there have been more and more public education efforts on FGM. We've had various NGOs like Forward, individual activists like Layla Hussein, who has undergone the procedure herself. She's been very outspoken about it. And I think they've gone out and given talks in schools and so on. But again, I mean, this whole sector is very, very under-resourced and just lacks capacity. And we just need more and more people speaking out about their own experiences of FGM and dissuading elders in those communities from adopting the practice.
Which in fact a woman did this morning on radio. It was really shocking. On the other hand, she'd been able to go on and have 4 children.
Was that Layla Hussein herself out of interest or somebody completely different?
I think so.
Yeah?
Yeah. Speaks to school.
Sorry, I'm coming to you next, I promise. Yes.
Hello, thanks for the speech, by the way, it was great. My name's Prince. I'm an atheist and a humanist. The main concern I have about these anti-radicalization programs is that, like much of the anti-terrorism legislation that passed after 9/11 and 7/7, there are cases where that legislation ends up being abused. And Shami Chakrabarti actually wrote a book on this recently, on liberty, and she mentions how the governments ended up using those laws to prevent protests, to spy on Greenpeace members. And I'm just wondering, I'm sorry if this is ground you already covered, what safeguards are there against the abuse of these policies? Because although their intentions underlying them are good, and their intentions which I support, I'm just not comfortable with the idea of identifying extremists and working to prevent the rise of extremism if there aren't measures in place to prevent those in power from using those powers to, I don't know, fight against protesters who are actually doing good things and fight against other organizations that just might not be might not hold views which are very popular at the time. So that's my question.
Well, the prevent duty has only been in place since last summer, so it's still developing as a whole, and that includes the safeguards against the kind of abuses of power that you mentioned. But what I can say is that a lot of referrals, in terms of the case studies that I've seen, they only go to the first stage. So, for example, the student might be called in front of a teacher or something, or, rather than going to the police or being escalated any further. And again, I think a lot of the so-called escalation is actually a myth peddled by organisations with a vested interest, unfortunately.
Thank you. Tehmina, hi. I was wondering if you could elucidate any work that you have done up to now with the Ahmadi community and how they relate to the work you do, this particular subject, and in particular, especially, given their persecution in Pakistan, how it sort of accentuates the way in which cultural conservatives have captured the Islamic narrative with respect to what you're talking about.
Well, exactly a month ago, I spoke at the Scottish Secular Society on the murder of Asad Shah and sectarianism in Muslim communities more broadly. So I spoke about the way that, the terrible way that Ahmadis have been treated over the years. For example, having their mosque in Walsall boycotted, not by the EDL, but by Sunni Muslims. And the fact that Ahmadi butchers in Tooting, since 2009, there's been a concerted campaign to boycott those, again, perpetrated by Sunni Muslims. And I think it's really important, as a Sunni Muslim myself, or someone from that background, to speak on behalf of other sects and communities within Muslim communities more generally. And there was another speaker at this event who happened to be from Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland humanists. So he was talking about sectarianism in a Christian context in Northern Ireland too. So it was a very good synergy. I've written an article about this as well, about the Asad Shah murder, on the SIDA blog, if you want to read it. That's a blog for progressive writers of Muslim heritage.
Alan.
Tehmina, thank you for your talk. What about the way forward? I can understand first-generation immigrants bringing their conservative cultural values into the communities they come in. One would like to somehow think that second and third generation, with their integration with the indigenous population and the style of life, you could call it British way of life if you want to, would start to become more liberal in their outlook and their practices and so on. Do you see signs of that at all? I think I do where I live in Tower Hamlets a bit, but only I've got no way of measuring it, Yeah.
I think it's becoming more and more polarised, because while there's been a proliferation of liberal Muslim groups like the Inclusive Mosque Initiative that I mentioned earlier, as well as ex-Muslim groups and other dissenting Muslim voices, there are also many hardline and conservative Muslims in the younger generation, and I think a lot of that is to do with certain groups peddling identity politics and using your Muslim identity as a way of sticking it to the man, rather than being about any kind of spiritual or religious considerations in some cases. And I think that's a deeply worrying trend.
We have another question.
Okay, thank you for your talk. Your organisation's for secular democracy.
That's right.
I just wondered what, in more general terms, do you make a case, for example, against faith schools? Do you have a policy on faith schools? Because if one's pro-secularism in general, one would tend to think that faith schools are not a good idea.
Well, our policy on faith schools is, well, we obviously realistically can't see them being eradicated anytime soon. So what we do in the interim is try and contribute to initiatives that seek to make them more inclusive in terms of what they teach, the content of the curriculum, but also admissions. So we're members of the Accord Coalition, and I believe the BHA are as well. And a couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to ask to be one of the judges on the Accord Coalition's Inclusive Schools Award, which rewarded the school that had done the most to promote equalities in an innovative way.
Tehmina, going back to your question with Phil, many of my Muslim friends would not consider you a Muslim because you have said that there are edicts in the Quran that are wrong. Now, most of my Muslim friends have their own narrative of Islam that they create in their head, but at no time do they criticise the Quran or the Prophet Muhammad. Now, the question I'd like to ask you is, who has the right version of Islam? Is it you? Is it them? Or who knows what real Islam is? Because if it cannot be criticised or analysed, how do we know who's giving us the truth?
Well, there's no way of knowing. I mean, I suppose you could say nobody and everybody has the right version of Islam, but I mean, we would say that the interpretation of Islam that is most consonant with modern equality and human rights standards and sort of secures justice for people, that has to be the one that's the right one. But that's what we would say. The thing about BMSD is we never decided who is and isn't Muslim. We've always said it's very much for the individual who's to self-define as Muslim. Whereas other organizations, they'll take it upon themselves to decide that Ahmadis are not Muslim, for example, and that's just completely wrong. We see Muslimness as part of an identity, and you can relate to Muslimness in different ways, whether as a religious Muslim or spiritual Muslim or cultural Muslim, an ex-Muslim, an agnostic Muslim. We sort of acknowledge all of those.
Maybe there's maybe Islam needs more divisions, more subdivisions, like we're getting here and across Europe and everywhere else. Maybe they need to quantify themselves, and maybe that extremists will stand up.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
So we've got a question at the front end.
Yeah, just a quick one back to Prevent, because obviously I didn't really know much about this until I came here, and I've always seen it as synonymous with Islam or Muslims, and if only 56% of the referrals are Islamic, what are the demographics for the rest of them? And I was just wondering how kind of the reintegration works, whether there are reoffending rates and whether or not those referrals have any ramifications as far as criminal law and criminal records going forward.
I don't think we have that information as yet because, again, as I said, the Prevent strategy is so new in terms of when it became a statutory duty. So we don't have the statistics on that in terms of criminal referrals. But in terms of the other part of your question, a substantial number of referrals are for far-right extremism, and that's something, again, that gets missed out of the Prevent
it's new to me.
Angle. Yeah.
But also, sorry, but tell me if I'm wrong. The way Prevent works is this through channel, and so you can be referred and nothing else happens. So, so your status in terms of the police and the law is actually unchanged.
That's right.
It's only if you get put to the next level. So that first referral is actually quite very straightforward. Let's have a chat.
Exactly that.
You can't be just charged willy-nilly with extremism.
No, that's right. You can't be just charged. That's right. Yeah.
That's YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Karen. Karen had a question.
I'd just like to take issue with the chair because on conspiracy theories, because I had breakfast with Elvis this morning and he's very much alive. Regarding your comment about, I think you said more divisions in Islam. Well, we're seeing what's happened in the Middle East and how they are divided. I believe there's something like 73 different official brands of Islam, and so when they divide, they get very, very angry with each other. And of course, particularly more recently, we see Muslims killing more Muslims rather than the other way around. So I'm not sure whether more divisions is the answer.
But at the same time, you want to celebrate and highlight diversity within Muslim communities. So you want to make those differences a positive thing rather than a negative thing, rather than something that causes sectarianism. You want to celebrate.
If you go into some mosques, you'll receive very, very different
That's right, but again, there have been initiatives to address this. So, for example, in 2013, the Muslim Institute teamed up with Iman, which is the LGBT Muslim organization, to put on a conference on Islam and diversity and different ways to be a Muslim. And I just think it's really positive that such an event was able to happen. Yeah. More often, I agree. Oh, bless you.
My name's Jim. Thank you for a very enlightening talk. You mentioned that you've spoken in various places, but they all seem to be atheist, secular, humanist places. You're preaching to the converted. Have you been able to speak in a mosque or at Islamic societies, which is where your message should be going?
Yeah, I was speaking, well, I meant universities. So in universities, no Islamic society has invited me to date. It has been the atheist, humanist and secularist societies, but when going out of universities, I have had invitations to speak from a number of Muslim organizations as well. And one of the most high profile was the Islamic Society of Britain, which is one of the biggest and longest standing Muslim organizations in the country. And every 2 years they have a Living Islam festival, where you get Muslims from a variety of persuasions, some quite conservative Muslims as well as liberals, those in between. And there was a panel on Britishness and Islam 2 years ago that I was invited to speak at. And there were a couple of people in the audience who asked quite challenging questions, but it was just really good to have that space to be able to debate with them in the first place.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I feel like that's my third one now, but just to play devil's advocate on the whole liberal Islam thing, and someone mentioned about the 63 sects, and that's actually a hadith. So there's a saying for Muhammad which says there will be 73 different sects of Islam and only one of them will be the true one and one of them will go to heaven. And then there are all these issues that you keep kind of coming up against, which are in Islamic scripture, and whether it's about gay rights or women's rights and so on. So do you sometimes feel like perhaps it's like as effective to also present, for reform Islam can work for some people, but for some people it's just straight out rejection of religion, or going down or like for me, for example, it was liberal Islam never made sense, and atheism and just kind of religion not being true at all resonated with me a lot more. So do you feel like perhaps these anti-radicalization bodies might benefit from not just presenting these individuals with liberal theologians and also exposing them to, I mean, it would feel like atheist preaching, so I don't know how I feel about that, but I just want to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I very much agree that there should be a sort of wide range of speakers offered in these one-to-one channel interventions, and that includes progressive theologians, but also ex-Muslims who want to speak about their experiences. And I really think that progressive Muslims and ex-Muslims need to work closely together a lot more than we have been doing. And I'm glad that we're starting to change on that front. So, for example, I've done various pieces of work with Mariam Namazi and One Law for All on the issues to do with human rights and equalities, such as the recent government inquiry into Sharia councils. And they've done an open letter just to sort of critique that and say, well, this is an inquiry into Sharia councils, so why do you have a theologian leading it, but also theologians advising it? Where are the advisors with human rights expertise, for example? So these are the areas where we can collaborate and be a really strong, unified voice.
Yes, Peter. Oh, sorry, there's someone who said I doesn't speak. I'll come back to you, Peter.
I was just wondering if you think the government's policy over the last 15 years in terms of its counter-terrorism approach, whether you think that is well-founded and done seemingly in their minds for the right ideas in the right way, or whether you think they're doing it because they have to be seen to be doing something, but that actually there are maybe compromises that they're making, like with their strong ties to a lot of places like Saudi Arabia, that maybe they can only go with so many limits.
I think the strategy as a whole is well-intentioned and has always been well-intentioned, but the execution before, in the last, say, when I first started, I started this role in 2009, and I'd say the strategy was quite poor up until about 2012, because of things like Project Champion. But not only that, they were actually giving funding, prevent funding, to what I consider to be the wrong organisations. A lot of organisations that didn't subscribe to British values, that didn't promote truly progressive interpretations of Islam, and they just sort of squandered that money, really, and that was a real problem. But fortunately, as I said in the talk, they've responded to practitioner feedback, they've gotten rid of the projects that utilise excessive surveillance, and now some positive interventions have come about because of Prevent.
Peter, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, a question this time, instead of a ramble. Thank you. Yes, a question. And you talked about the number of people who sort of picked up in the classroom, and the percentage of people identified as Muslims, and then you've got the far right seems to be the next largest group. Now, to me, there's something in common here. To what extent do you think that patriarchy is a main obstacle in your work?
Oh, it's a huge obstacle in so many different ways. And I find that if you're a Muslim woman working in the space, the kind of abuse you get is far more personal than if it were a male activist. So, for example, when we first put out our advice for schools in 2010 on cultural and religious issues affecting Muslim pupils, which is currently being revised, by the way, in light of Trojan Horse and Prevent and all these other developments. But when we first put out in 2010, there was a blog called Ummah Pulse, which was not only very critical of the advice itself, but started attacking us as individuals. And one of the things they wrote was, I must wear mini-skirts, apparently. And that was the sort of sum total of their criticism, you know. and I find that other women in this space also receive similar abuse. So, for example, my associate Sarah Khan, who works for the progressive Muslim women's group Inspire, had to shut down her Twitter account because the abuse she was getting was that bad. And I personally have never had an account on Twitter for that reason, because I know I'd get the same. Yeah.
Tehmina, may I ask a question? Thank you so much for such an amazing talk. Thank you. What can we do? That's really what I'd like to know, to help you spread your word. And the other thing that upsets me so much is the regressive left.
Yes, exactly.
You were talking briefly about it earlier. How do we reach those people and maybe change hearts and minds?
Well, I found that the Facebook group, the BMST Facebook group, it has over 8,000 members, and you're a very valued member of it. And we have... feel free to join, because we have topical... Sorry?
They're in my hall now.
They have... Yeah, exactly. And we host topical issues topical discussions on issues affecting British Muslims on a daily basis, and these are very, very active discussions. And some members of the group, non-Muslim members, have said that witnessing the interactions in this group, listening to Muslims who passionately believe in secular democracy and actually doing something to further it, has actually stopped them from harbouring anti-Muslim sentiment, and I think that's really powerful. And in terms of building links with the left, or the regressive left, as we call them, that is a really, really tricky one. I think what I would really like to do is to be able to address a meeting of such people, because they've always been very critical of our work, and sort of unjustly critical and quite unfairly critical, I think. It's not even legitimate criticism. It's not criticism based on any kind of factual position. Again, a lot of it is just lies and misinformation. So I'd like to sort of have an opportunity to correct some of those.
We need to maybe set one of those meetings up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think humanists have a very good role in terms of facilitating that. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Tehmina. I just wanted to carry on from the point that Stell's made. Her question was, most of the people here don't have an Islam background. What can we do to help you? Please tell us what we should do now to help you.
It would really help if you could amplify the work of BMSD, share it on your social media pages, articles or videos, and just get the message out there. That's all you can do. Or sort of raise it with your friends and tell them that there is a group that is promoting secular democracy in Muslim communities and combating extremism and combating anti-Muslim sentiment.
Yes, we have one more question. Thank you, Rumit.
Are people clear what democracy means these days? Even in the time of the ancient Greeks, there were many different kinds of democracy. And so is it really easy to describe it to people?
Yes, I mean, in terms of democratic values, I mean, when we've gone out and done democracy workshops with refugees, which is another plank of our work, we've done so with the refugee charity Praxis, and we've had people from all kinds of backgrounds, people coming from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, all kinds of countries, and we speak to them about their own experiences with politics and how they feel certain organizations can protect their rights in this country, and just talking to them about different civic engagement methods and how they can become more active citizens here in the UK. So I find that it's really helpful when you speak in terms of democratic values, democratic institutions, how you can engage with them to make positive change.
Yes,
Yeah?
we have one more right next to you. Thank you.
I'm glad that someone mentioned the regressive left. I'm a bit of a fan of Sam Harris. And I know that over the years he's received quite a lot of criticism from people who are described as regressive leftists. But in the same way that I used to be a Christian and atheism affected my views and the rights affected my views, I feel like the regressive left do make some good points about the degree to which policies that have good intentions can eventually lead to abuse. And I'm wondering, from you having listened to some of the arguments presented by the regressive left, whether there are any points that they make which you feel are forceful or which have changed your view on what you do at all. So do they make any good points?
Probably the best point, but it's a point that I agreed with anyway, regardless of their intervention, is about the portrayal of Muslims in the media. And we've seen a very recent example of this with the way that Fatima Manji, the Channel 4 news reporter, was treated when she covered the Nice attack. And Kelvin Mackenzie immediately wrote a column in The Sun asking why a headscarf-wearing woman should be covering an incident like this. Unfortunately, she's actually responded in the Liverpool Echo, and it's a very good response, a blistering response to him. So I think there's always been a huge problem in terms of myths and misinformation about Muslims being peddled in the right-wing media. For example, we've seen in the Daily Express stories about Muslim prisoners, how they demand this and that, how they demand compasses to know which way to pray, or talk of Muslims renaming Christmas Winterval or something like that. And then it actually turns out not to be Muslims making this demand at all. So that really needs to change. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? That's probably perfect timing, as Tehmina has to run off. But thank you so much for coming this evening. And
thank you so much for inviting me.
And there's a lot more time for. I mean, you're staying with us for about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
So maybe some people might jump on. on you for a few questions, but please enjoy the wine bar and all the money goes to, and if you haven't yet dropped £3 into the pink bucket, please do so on your way out. And all the money collected goes to that's right, yes.
Oh, thank you so much.
Which I thought you had decided that, but maybe we did. Sorry. So spend lots of money there, and it all goes to the charity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.